My grandmother read her horoscope and talked to the conjure woman to make the right tea to solve a problem. Some of my friends find peace in yoga and Buddhist meditation. Other Black folk gather crystals, turn tarot cards, and set up ancestral altars, and go to church every Sunday. Or maybe they don't, because churches condemn their practices, but they have no problem with Jesus.
Wade in the water. Wade in the water, children. Wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water.
Welcome to Diverse Devotions, Black Belief Across Boundaries, where we wade into the waters of religious multiplicity, Black faith, and spiritual journeys. Discover what happens when Black spirituality breaks the rules of how being religious is supposed to work. I'm Monica A. Coleman, writer, university professor, ordained clergy person, and initiated Iyala Orisha. In Diverse Devotions, I'll lead you through a tapestry of captivating narratives and thought-provoking dialogues. We'll hear the spiritual journeys of Black folk who practice more than one religion. We'll also hear from individuals whose acceptance of different religions emanates from an understanding of laws of nature and universal spiritual principles. From the freedom of religious multiplicity to the personal journeys of transformation, each episode offers enlightening perspectives that expand the boundaries of Black belief. So, if you're a seeker hungry for knowledge, religiously devout, an educator curious to understand, or simply intrigued by spirituality's rich diversity, follow and like Diverse Devotions. Be a part of this journey, because at the heart of these stories, you'll find the spirit of freedom. I am glad to welcome to the podcast today Dr. Takiyah Nur Amin. Takiyah Amin is a dance scholar, educator, and academic success strategist. She is identified as a Unitarian Universalist for more than 20 years. Her writing has been featured in UU World Magazine, on Worship Web, and in 2 edited volumes, Care for the World, Reflections on Community Ministry, and BLUU Notes, an Anthology of Love, Justice, and Liberation. Dr. Amin has consulted on curriculum design and led faculty development for several colleges, universities, and seminaries through her company Black Girl Brilliance, LLC. Currently, Dr. Amin serves Unitarian Universalism as a member of the Ministerial Fellowship Committee and UU Studies Network. We're glad to welcome to the podcast Dr. Takiyah Amin.
Hooray! Glad to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
I'm so glad to have you. And, I know someone's sitting there listening to the podcast thinking, all Dr. Coleman does is invite her friends. Yeah, pretty much. No, that's not really true. But I have known you for not quite 20 years, but pretty close to 20 years at this point. And we worked together on some projects. So I know that not only are you a quality person, but I really am glad that you're willing to share some of your personal journey, because you do great academic work, of course, and great administrative work, but your personal journey with the listeners here at Diverse Devotions. One of the first things I want to ask you to do is tell us about your spirituality, about your faith journey, and how you got to where you started to where you are now.
Well, again, thank you for the invitation. And it's really nice to have a chance to talk about things that are beyond the scope of, the work that I do professionally. I like to say that I grew up in a multi-faith family. I'm originally from Buffalo, New York. My grandparents on both sides were Christian. My parents would tell you that they were radicalized in the 1960s and both converted to Islam at that time. Um, my parents initially joined the Nation of Islam, but by the time I was born in the late 70s, they left the nation to attend a more progressive, predominantly Black mosque in our city on the east side of Main Street. Um, I should actually go back half a step and say, just as a point of clarification, that when my parents got married, my mother had not converted yet. She did make the choice to convert to Islam later on her own accord, which my father was supportive of and happy with, of course. But by the time I came along, I had Muslim parents and Christian grandparents, and I didn't think that was weird or bad or wrong or strange. I mean, one of the wonderful things that I appreciate looking back now about growing up in Black community in Buffalo was that there was a lot of religious diversity. You had Christians, but you had lots of different kinds of Christians. You had Rastafarians who had come to Buffalo, up through Canada and then down to our city from various parts of the Caribbean. You had people in our community who were very interested in Kemetic religion and philosophy. So there were Black folks around me practicing all kinds of things. So I didn't think Blackness and sort of religious diversity didn't go together. In my own family, I think that I would characterize our relations as multi-faith. I wouldn't say interfaith because there wasn't much sharing of ritual or tradition in a particular way. But my parents were very respectful of my grandparents' beliefs and vice versa. You know, I sort of make the joke that it's not like my Christian grandparents were trying to sneak pork to me or something on the fly. You know, everybody was very
But did you
respectful.
get Christmas gifts though from your
Yes, but then,
grandparents?
yes, absolutely. But we all celebrated Kwanzaa starting the next day.
Oh.
So there's a way in which our commitment to Blackness
Mhm.
and our valuing of African American history, heritage, and culture, in some ways, I think, not superseded, but certainly grounded and contextualized even the way we did faith in my family. I will say, long story short, that as I got older, it was really important to me to find a religious community that did not require me to give up anyone that I loved. My background, is so much in dance and theater, and I have been in community with all kinds of people, but particularly people in LGBTQ plus community my entire life. And I did not want to be in a faith community that would not welcome those people. So that made being in the church difficult at that time. Um, I also consider myself to be feminist, and the gender politics of the mosque at that time did not make it comfortable for me to identify as a good Muslim woman either. And so for many years, I thought, well, I like God and I like prayer and I like faith, but maybe there's no place for me. I stumbled across Unitarian Universalism in high school. I'm having debates at the lunch table with friends, and a young man walked up to me and said, "You should come to the church where my father is a minister. I think you would like it." And I asked my mother about it, and she took me to the Unitarian Universalist congregation on Elmwood Avenue in Buffalo and dropped me off. And I really did feel deep resonance with Unitarian Universalism and the fact that um, it would not require me to give up the best of what I learned from either of the traditions that sort of shaped me or cut off any of the communities that I care about.
So that would be your how you would identify or how would you name, right, your spirituality or your religious belonging now?
You know,
Not
it's
that you necessarily go around
complicated.
naming it to yourself, but if you do,
Right. But
right?
it's complicated because people will
Mhm.
ask, right? One of the
Mhm.
things I've noticed is that when I'm in community with other people who are religious, if
Mhm.
they like me, they always think I'm whatever they are. Right?
Yeah.
So, people make assumptions, and
Mhm.
sometimes depending on the context, for my own comfort and or safety at various
Mhm.
points, I've
Mhm.
been comfortable to let people think whatever they thought. Generally, if people ask me, what's your religion or what's your faith, I will say I'm Unitarian Universalist,
Mhm.
but that's not always legible to people in terms of what I mean, if they've even heard of Unitarian Universalism or UUism, as we might call it. And also, there are assumptions about Unitarian Universalism that we're all humanist or that we're all atheistic in our orientation, which isn't true. And so, part of the, I think, complication is that I can use these descriptors as a kind of shorthand,
Mhm.
but that's not really me saying I'm a Unitarian Universalist doesn't really tell you what I believe. And usually we don't have time to get into the particulars and the contours of belief and commitment. So I am comfortable identifying as Unitarian Universalism because that is true. It's just not the only thing that's true.
All right, so I have follow-up questions, right?
Of
So
course.
one, Unitarian Universalist isn't a huge denomination in the US.
Mhm.
So people might not have any familiarity with it. Will you tell us a bit? I'm not saying a history lesson, but tell us
Sure.
about Unitarian Universalism, and then tell us what it is you believe, since
Sure.
I know that there multiple beliefs are held within UUism.
Right. So the shorthand that I give people is that Unitarians historically were non-Trinitarian Christians. They were just Christians who believed in Father, Son, Holy Spirit, but did not believe that they were the same entity. Universalists were historically Christians who did not believe in hell, believed that the doctrine of God's love exceeded God's wrath, and that God's mercy for creation was beyond any kind of anger or punishment that God might mete out for human beings. And so these were two religious movements that converged in the 1960s, largely because, one denomination had money and the other one had more people, and they kept bumping into each other in social justice spaces. And so the two denominations merged in 1961 and became, as we like to call ourselves, the little church with the really long name. The core question of Unitarian Universalism that reflects my deepest belief
Mhm.
is that the truth of our faith and the truth of our values is reflected most deeply in our relationships. Relationship to self, relationship to community, relationship to the natural world. And so when I'm talking to theology people, I like to point out that Unitarian Universalism is a covenantal faith tradition as opposed to being a confessional tradition. It's less about what you say you believe and more about how you live that belief in community and in relationship with others. That's not, however, saying you can believe whatever you want. Unitarian Universalism is grounded by a set of principles and practices that we use as sort of points of orientation for how we live in the world. But we come from a belief that while we are all different and all have different experiences of the holy, the core question is how are we going to live that out amongst this great diversity that we experience with each other in a way that is ethical and principled? So the core question of our faith is not, for example, about the nature of salvation in kind of a sense that might be more familiar to listeners, but more so about how do we build and live out a commitment to the beloved community despite our various interpretations and understandings of the holy.
That's super helpful, right? I think I know UUs have a long history in New England, so a lot of people in New England might be more familiar
Mhm.
with UUs and the history that is there. But this is super helpful. And in fact, it was funny as you were talking, and this is taking us a little far afield, but I'm gonna go far afield. We can always come
We
back.
can do that.
Um, is as soon as you said it, it made me think, I don't know why I haven't thought this before, but when Carlton Pearson was having his conversion to Universalist, I'm like, why didn't he go hang out with the UUs?
He did in Oklahoma and became one of the ministers at our big congregation in Tulsa.
Oh, okay, 'cause I knew he went and spent time with New Thought folk,
Hmm?
but in my head, I'm like, well, I think UU would probably be a better fit.
We had a great time.
Um,
Carlton came to our General Assembly twice. I
mhm,
actually met him at church conference
mhm,
shortly after his book on his kind of
mhm,
faith conversion came out.
mhm.
And he held regular services at All Souls Unitarian Universalists in Tulsa for many, many years before his passing. So yeah, he came and played with us, which
Yeah, I mean,
which
because
which, which blessed us quite a bit. And I
because
think
he
blessed
brought all
them.
that music.
Yes, he did bring a different tradition. Right? I always say when people come to Unitarian Universalism, it is not because of our great singing.
Right. So we've gone a little afield, but in terms of the universalism, though, almost in itself is a pluralist stance, right? Because you're saying that we don't have an idea about exclusivity in terms of what it takes to get to God or to get to heaven, right? If
Which
there's
which was really important to me for two reasons. One, when I think about my own family, You know, my grandmother was a AME woman. My grandfather, this is my mother's parents, was Baptist. But if I look at how they lived in comparison to my parents and what they really believed was important, it wasn't that different. You
Yeah.
know, there was a strong valuing in all those traditions around prayer. There was a strong valuing on um, living your values in a way that served an uplifted community,
Mhm.
love and care at the center of your practice. I mean, these were things that I was raised with.
Right.
And so by the time I bumped into Unitarian Universalism, the logics of it made
Mhm.
sense to me.
Yeah.
And while Unitarians and Universalists traditionally are Christian, you can still find Christian Unitarians, Christian Universalists. Um, the faith community has expanded over the years to embrace a range of religious identities. We have Jewish Unitarian Universalists. They call themselves Jews. We have Muslim Unitarian Universalists. There are human, so there are humanist Unitarian Universalists. So Unitarian Universalism doesn't require that one lop off
Right.
perhaps other traditions with which they belong or find deep resonance. There are things about Islam that resonate with me very deeply, particularly the commitment to study and intellectualism. That's really important to me. I still read the Quran. There are still elements of it that touch me deeply, but my faith isn't the same as my mother's,
Right.
right? There are things about the Bible that I love, particularly I am, a lover of the Psalms and the Proverbs. I love the parables and stories in the New Testament or Second Testament, depending on who you're talking to. And I find deep wisdom. I don't need it to be true,
Mhm.
that there was a great flood or,
Right.
a little boat with the animals two by two. I don't need those stories to literally be true in order for me to find deep wisdom in them.
Yeah.
But my faith is not the same as my grandmother's. That doesn't mean that there's no resonance,
Mhm.
connection, or that there's no valuing of bringing those traditions forward. And Unitarian Universalism is really the first place or the only place that I found that
Mhm.
didn't make me keep some
Mhm.
element of myself away in order to
Mhm.
be in community.
Well, I mean, I can see the attraction of that and why that would be so important to you, right, on a personal and familial level. So you're getting real close to it, but tell us, what do you believe, right? You said you've talked about where there's resonance, but if you were to say, what do you believe that?
Well, I would say first that,
Mhm.
like, which surprises some people who think all you use are atheist or humanist. I have a much more theistic orientation myself, probably because I was raised with God language and with God imagery that I still hold very dear, and that makes sense to me. But when I say God, I don't mean like a man in a throne in the sky or something.
Yeah.
When I say God, I'm really referring to the energy that shows up when we are in relationship and working with each other through a space of love and compassion. To me,
Mhm.
that whatever that entity is or that energy is, that's
Yeah.
God to me. That love energy, the thing that makes us choose the most loving decision or the most loving choice, that's God to me. In my family, whether you're talking to my mother or my grandmother, you would hear a lot of language about God's will for your life.
Right.
I've been thinking about this recently, and to me, I don't think of God's will as like a record where you're born and the arm goes down on the record and it's already predestined. And
Right.
I don't believe in sort of predestination or anything like that per se.
Mhm.
I think if there is such a thing as God's will for our lives, it is that we would choose to do the thing that is most loving and life affirming. And that can be a very difficult choice sometimes, especially when
Yeah.
you are in community with people who believe differently than you. I mean, one of the distinctions I think between Unitarian Universalism and other communities is we just take it as a given that we all think differently about this stuff.
Right.
And we take that as a good thing as our point of departure. Sometimes when I've been in other faith spaces, the assumption is, or it seems like the goal is that we're all believing the same thing and feeling the same thing and thinking the same thing and having the same experiences of the holy or the divine. Unitarian Universalism just says, nope, we all probably have different experiences and different ways of resonating around this, but what is the truth that we can share, and how do we activate that in community together? How do we live that out in a way that feels principled and ethical? So one of my beliefs is that that's the most important part, not the finer doctrinal point of what you might believe about the nature of baptism or fasting or whatever. How do we live with each other in a way that cultivates love, compassion, justice, and empathy? Like, how do we do that, even in moments like this one that perhaps feel really polarized and charged? So that's the core piece for me of what I really believe. I don't believe in eternal punishment. I do believe that love is unending and expansive. And I do think there's something that happens to us after life on this plane ends, but I really believe that it's some version of reattaching to that larger, loving, infinite energy. Um, I don't believe in original sin. That probably comes more so, though, from being raised by Muslim parents, because Islam doesn't have a doctrine of original sin either. So that idea never really resonated with me in the same way. I like Jesus. People often want to know what you think about Jesus. I like Jesus a lot. But in my mind, I think of Jesus as like a good Jewish boy who understood the limits and the emptiness of empire and was interested in liberating his people and his community, not as a blood sacrifice that somehow had to happen for me and God to have a relationship. So yeah, those are definitely some of my most persistent consistent beliefs over time.
So I gotta ask, like, what does this look like, right? What does that look like in your life? Like, do you pray 5 times a day? Um, what is your actual spiritual practice look like?
It's
Like, what
about
does
practice.
prayer look like for you? Maybe it's not prayer, maybe it's meditation. Can you tell us a little bit? I know this is a
Yeah.
personal question, but what does your faith look like, on the daily?
What's interesting is that the honest answer, do
Mhm,
you pray 5 times a day? Do you fast? Is it meditation? Is it this? The honest answer is sometimes. I mean, there have been points in my life where, depending on what I was experiencing,
mhm,
I felt like I needed to pray 5 times a day. There
mhm,
are times now where if I'm overwhelmed or in pain and I feel like I need to pray, I might
mhm,
open my mouth and Arabic will come out
mhm,
because it's in there. It's a part of my
mhm,
stew, my soup.
mhm,
I've had a tradition at various points of praying the hours.
mhm,
In terms of
mhm,
reading religious texts, I mean, I'm like a lot of people. I got 5 Bibles in here, 6 different Quranic translations, and the Bible app on my phone, and the
mhm,
Quran app on my phone.
mhm,
Sometimes I will turn the setting on the Quran app because I want to hear the call to prayer.
mhm,
Not necessarily because I'm going to stop and pray, but because it reminds me
mhm,
of something bigger than the immediate that I might be distracted by or overwhelmed by. I would say that the most consistent part of my spiritual practice is what I understand or would call prayer,
mhm,
but that has taken different forms. Sometimes prayer might be me singing loudly, badly, and off key, but it might be me singing, a Negro spiritual or one of the hymns that I know from listening to my grandmother. It might be me cleaning my kitchen and singing Thomas Dorsey's Precious Lord, which was my grandmother's favorite song. It might be me choosing when Ramadan comes around to fast for several days because that makes me feel a certain kind of connection to my mother and her tradition. But also, I do find fasting useful from time to time to, to just to clean out and clarify what's important
mhm,
and what isn't. I like to write, so journaling sometimes, but sometimes my journaling is more stream of consciousness.
mhm.
And that to me can be a prayer practice.
Yeah.
I love dance, and so movement, dance or gentle movement. I mean, I've done what I would call a walking meditation or
Uh,
dance as prayer. So
do
usually,
you use like labyrinths?
The first congregation that I ever attended in Buffalo had a huge labyrinth in the back, which I loved. And then
Mhm.
I've lived in, I don't know, 9, 10 different cities. When I was in Philadelphia, my
Mhm.
congregation there had a labyrinth that I would walk. Yeah, I mean, Unitarian Universalists value a range of different spiritual practices, and sometimes we get in trouble as a faith because one of the criticisms, right, of
Mhm.
Unitarian Universalism is, oh, y'all just borrow stuff from everybody else. You know,
Yeah.
if you like Buddhist meditation, you'll just take it. If you like this other tradition's practice, and it's less about a kind of appropriative
Mhm.
choice, but it is about what is meaningful and most helpful in the moment to
Mhm.
reconnect you to your deepest values. For me, that is usually some combination of writing, movement, and silence
Mhm.
in some combination. But it might be any given thing at a time, depending on what is really happening in my life.
Well, you said a little bit about this, but can you say more maybe about where your faith tradition or your communities fall on the issues of justice and freedom, right? We're Black people, and so freedom
Hmm.
comes up a lot because we're always trying to be more and more free because for a variety of reasons we're not free enough. And
Right.
so is
Right.
this, are is there things about justice or fairness or
Yeah.
equality or freedom struggles that seem to be a
Absolutely.
part of your own faith?
Absolutely. I mean, part of why the Unitarian and Universalist traditions merged administratively in the 60s was because they kept bumping into each other
Mhm.
at social justice demonstrations and rallies on behalf of civil rights and justice making.
Mhm.
You will hear language about justice making and social change in many Unitarian Universalist congregations or covenanted communities all the time. You will hear the phrase justice, equity, and compassion in human relations as essential to our work. A lot of the kind of interfaith work that Unitarian Universalists have done over the decades has been in these cross-religious or trans-religious formations, because if we're working for justice and so are you, we want to be in on that. We want to be
Mhm.
committed to that, whatever your religious path is. If you are also committed to not doing harm, we want to engage with you in a meaningful way and cultivate that. Um, at the same time, there have been issues, right? I mean, one of the biggest kind of soft spots in the history of Unitarian Universalism in this country is that you had a large exodus of Black folks leaving the faith in
Mhm.
the 1960s due to some internal issues around our commitments as a faith tradition to Black liberation. So by the time I show up, as a bright-eyed, bushy-tailed young person in the 90s,
Mhm.
there had been somewhat of a reckoning around what was owed to Black people in this tradition. I made the comment earlier that it was important for me to find a faith that didn't require me to be less than all of who I am. But the truth of the matter is, when I came into Unitarian Universalism in the 90s, you would hear people say, well, you can be Black or you can be but you can't really be both. And what they
Mhm.
meant was,
Mhm.
you can either be committed to this broader,
Mhm.
multi-culty, dynamic, flexible faith
Mhm.
thing, but you have to give up all that stuff that sounds too Black or is grounded in Black
Mhm.
experience.
Mhm.
Well, that wasn't going to happen for me anyway, because of my own commitments and love for myself, my
Mhm.
people, my history, my community. And also, that commitment around study has shown me that there's never been a point in the development of Unitarianism or Universalism that Black folks haven't been a part of. You can go to many UU congregations, and if you join, there will be a UU 101 kind of
Mhm.
workshop.
Yeah.
And a lot of people like to teach
New
those.
members class.
New members class, right.
Yeah.
But a lot of people like to teach that workshop
Mhm.
as if folks of color were never part of this tradition until like 20 minutes ago. They want to lift up William Ellery Channing and Thoreau and all
Mhm.
these other people and ignore that Black folks have been around since this was an institution to be around in, and that
Mhm.
our work towards liberation and justice has also informed the logics of these faith traditions. We are much more comfortable saying that in 2025 than we were in 1995. I
Right.
want to believe that some of the work that I've done in my tradition has helped to make that true. But there was no either I'm going to be black or be UU. It's I'm black and Unitarian Universalist at the same time.
Mhm.
And I wrestle with the challenges or discontents that come with that. But it certainly isn't a historical point to suggest that we just got here 20 minutes ago. People like to act like this is the good white folks' religion and black folks should just be glad to be guests when that's just not accurate.
Well, when I did your bio, I talked about BLUU, right, which is spelled BLUU. And I know you have been very active in the leadership of BLUU. Will you tell our listeners a bit about BLUU and, kind of where Blackness is, so to say, within Unitarian Universalism?
Sure. And it's so interesting because I just realized maybe 2, 3 days ago that 2025 marks 10 years
Mhm.
of BLU's existence in my tradition. BLUE stands for Black Lives of Unitarian Universalism and was a formation that began in 2005 by some Black folks who were in this tradition who sought to really amplify Unitarian Universalism's commitment not only to the presence of Black folks, but to our history and to leverage the resources of our faith towards Black liberation. I served on our organizing collective board for many years and did work there that I'm really proud of in community with other folks. Everything from doing teach-ins around the history of the presence of Black folks in Unitarian Universalism to being in on the early groundwork of building affordable housing in Minnesota, which just broke ground last year. And so another piece of it, I think, that's important to lift up is that BLUE was instrumental in reaching out to a lot of the African American elders who left Unitarian Universalism in the 60s, many of whom still identified as Unitarian Universalists. They just stopped coming to church.
I mean, and it happens, right?
Exactly. We hosted a national convening and brought those people back to spend time together, to share stories, to re-engage them. And now you can find BLUE Worship online. You can find BLUE Havens, which are small kind of study groups and prayer communities across the country. We are still doing the work of launching BLUE Harbors, which will be kind of Black UU congregations that are nested within larger existing Unitarian Universalist congregations. So it looks quite different now to be Black in a UU space than it did 5 years ago, 10 years ago, certainly 20 years ago. But that is a result of the steadfast work of not just myself, but other Black folks in this tradition who've been committed to pulling our history in this tradition forward and also using it as source to think about how Black folks live out Unitarian Universalism in a way that doesn't necessarily look like the way everybody else does it.
Well, since we're talking about Blackness, right? Do your family members are Christian and Muslim, right? You never mentioned having any other UU family members. So do you ever feel like perhaps a religious minority amongst other Black people? Um, because, you've talked about how Black people are positioned within Unitarian Universalists, but how do you feel as a Black UU person, right, who honors multiple faiths, right, within your commitment to justice and God's love, etc. When you're around just, in Black communities?
It's hard. I'm not gonna pretend it's been hard at different points. In my own family, it's okay. They think I'm kind of strange anyway. So Takiyah does her church thing and it seems to be loving and kind, so we'll leave her alone. Like my family is okay with it. But I have had moments, particularly when there have been um big things happening in kind of the national life of Black people, right? Black Lives Matter movement or Trayvon Martin's death or moments when Black community is grieving. I have definitely had the struggle of wanting to be with Black people in those moments, right? But I've had the experience of being with Black people and then I'm put on the spot to explain why my prayers don't sound like their prayers when we're all grieving together. At the same time, I want to be with people in my faith community when things like that happen.
Mhm.
But if I'm just with mainstream Unitarian Universalism, which is still predominantly white, then I'm put on the spot to explain why I'm particularly angry or particularly hurt or
Mhm.
particularly confused by something that's having a negative impact on my community. So when I get to be in community with other Black Unitarian Universalists, the first thing that happens, honestly, I can physically feel my heart rate go down.
Ah,
I can feel
like
my
that exhale.
I can feel my shoulders, you know, lowering. They're no longer attached up by my ears. The
Mhm.
stress in my body leaves because, particularly in moments of grief and pain, I don't want to be called on to explain why I believe what I believe. I don't want to have to explain my faith in those moments, and I don't want to have to explain my Blackness in those moments. I want to be with people who get it. And so sometimes that's been really lonely when I get to be with other Black UUs, whether virtually or in physical space, even if we're in small numbers, there's a kind of relief and
Mhm.
release because I don't have to explain, clarify, defend. I can just be. And part of why I'm committed to doing the work of
Mhm.
continuing to build those BLUU communities and spaces for Black people in Unitarian Universalism is because I don't want other people to have to experience that kind of what sometimes I have felt as sadness or awkwardness or even ostracism. I want other people to have community too. One of my favorite things is when I'm with Black UUs and like little kids are around
Mhm.
because I'm thinking to myself, these Black kids are going to grow up in this tradition and they're not going to know any different.
Right.
They're gonna
Blue baby. Like
they're
blue
dominant.
babies.
Right. I like to call them blueberries.
Oh,
Um,
makes sense. Blueberries. Yeah.
the you know, their dominant references for Unitarian Universalism will be Black because
Mhm.
that's what they're growing up in, with, and around. And I should be clear that while there are Black folks in this country who were born and raised in UU families, most Americans who identify as Unitarian Universalist came to this tradition from other traditions.
Mhm.
So yes, you have some cradle to grave UUs, but you more often have folks who found this tradition at some point in their late teens or adulthood. And like I said, when I came in, the dominant references were really white and really narrow in a way. And so I'm committed to making that table broader, wider, and actually just more reflective of the historical truth of our tradition.
Well, I mean, thank you so much for all that you've shared. And I think this has been a great lesson, both in terms of your own spirituality, but really a great lesson about UUs, right? Because it's not always discussed as much, I think, in the wider religious world.
Yeah.
So
We
let's
like to call
say,
ourselves the tiniest crumb on the communion table sometimes.
well, yeah, I won't even go here. I was like, do y'all serve communion?
Sometimes there
Sometimes.
is there
Is that
is
the answer to everything? Like sometimes?
well, sometimes it depends on who you with, right? Like there
Right.
is a UU Christian fellowship
Hmm.
where you have Christians who also identify as UU and they
Hmm.
do communion and they celebrate Christmas, they celebrate Easter and the same.
Hmm.
I mean, they do that. Now, the way that they might inform or talk about those rituals
Hmm.
isn't necessarily going to have the same doctrinal alignment
Yeah.
that you might find with the more mainstream tradition, but it's there. I mean, we have pagan Unitarian Universalists who gather and
Oh,
worship, and you will see them doing earth-based
hmm.
rituals and engaging in a way that might seem odd or how does this align? But these are
Hmm.
people who identify as pagan and as UU because Unitarian Universalism for them becomes a framework or a kind of orientation towards love and justice that informs their pagan ritual practice, right? So
Right.
the fact that you can have people who might identify both as Muslim and UU or Jewish and UU isn't strange for us,
Hmm.
but it might seem like, what are those people over there doing to others?
Well, all right, so let's say we have listeners here who are curious and this like this sounds amazing. Where do I want to know more? Where do I start? How do I learn? How do I start practicing? Like what is a good practical first step for someone who's listening to the pod and wants to know more about Unitarian Universalism or about Black Unitarian Universalism?
The first thing I would say is go to the website for our church association, www.uua.org. That will give you a great big button that you can click on to find a congregation close to you. And there's lots of very accessible information there. I would also want to lift up and plug Church of the Larger Fellowship, which is our largest congregation. It's entirely virtual. Started out as military ministry, expanded to prison ministry, and at various points where I've lived in communities where there was no UU congregation, I could worship online with CLF, and that ministry has really been helpful and a gift to me. A lot of people found it during COVID as well, and we were very happy about that. If you want to know more about BLUU, you can look up Black Lives of Unitarian Universalism or blacklivesuu.org, and you can find online worship. You can find out more about how Black folks are interpreting and practicing Unitarian Universalism. You can become a BLUU Beloved, which will allow you to join the mailing list and come to worship and do all those other things. And, one thing I can say for sure is that we would love to have anyone who is interested in exploring these questions of living lives of principle and love and justice in the world. We are warm and welcoming, and we'll be glad to see you. I will say that's one of the stereotypes of UUs, that we're generally very warm and that we're very interested in people. And it is true. It comes from our commitment to relationality and covenant. So I've brought Black folks with me to church sometimes, and they'll go, "Are these people really that nice?" And the answer generally is yes. We really
Yeah.
are, for the most part, a very warm and friendly lot.
Well, as you were talking, and we'll make sure all this information gets in the show notes for our listeners. It also made me think about, one way many people, at least in my orbit, and this is in like the parent orbit, encounter UUs, if they're not UUs, are through the OWL curriculum.
Yeah.
And yet when I'm having these conversations, it seems like very few Black people know about OWL.
Yeah.
So tell
Yeah.
us about OWL a little bit, because
Yeah.
people, I know a lot of people, they're not UU, but they will drop their children off at the UU community
That's
because
true.
OWL is such fire. It's so good.
And I have to say that that is another piece. If people, even if they've never come to a Sunday morning, people do know us for what we call RE, or religious education, or contemporarily what we call lifespan faith development, which
Look at that.
OWL is a
That
part
new
of.
word, lifespan. I like that. Lifespan faith. I'm
Lifespan
gonna
faith
take that to some Black
development.
church.
Yeah,
Lifespan faith
please.
development.
Because it reminds us that Sunday school or religious education isn't supposed to
Yeah.
stop when you get out of high school.
Yeah, we just talked about adult Sunday school, but yeah, I like
Right.
that
It's supposed to be
lifespan.
across the lifespan, right?
Yeah.
And so OWL is a curriculum that Unitarian Universalists actually developed in partnership with the United Church of Christ. Again, if
I
people
love
are
them
trying to
too.
do justice facing work, we usually want to be a part of that. And
Hmm.
we've collaborated with UCC on curriculum and projects for many years. But OWL is Our Whole Lives,
Hmm.
which is the curriculum that teaches us all about our bodies and health, sex, sexuality, and gender. It starts in kindergarten. There's our curriculum even for adults. One of the things that I know is an effort for our Lifespan Faith Development Office nationally is to bring our facilitators to where communities already are together. Or to say it another way, where are Black youth already gathering? Is it a Boys and Girls Club? Can we connect with them and get an OWL facilitator to lead the workshop
Oh,
there?
there. That
As
would,
opposed to bringing people to us, where are people and how can we dispatch folks?
yeah.
Because we're in a moment where I think a lot of families and parents want more information
Yeah.
and need the language and facility to talk about these things with their young people, or even to consider
Mhm.
them for themselves. I will say, if you go to the UUA website, there is a wealth of information on OWL, as well as a parent's guide
Yeah.
for how you can facilitate those conversations, if that is information that's resonant for you. But yeah, I know plenty folks who ended up at church because they were dropping their kid off for
For
progressive
owl.
for progressive religious education, and then we brought them in gradually. But we're very proud of doing kind of
Mhm.
faith development and faith education that is broad, inclusive, and celebratory of all of the identities that our young people might have.
Thank you so much for talking about that. So I
Yeah.
want, and we'll make sure I get a link to, we'll put a link to that in the show notes too.
Listen, I love OWL. I love that,
Mhm.
even in my own life, as I've moved around, one of the things I always look for at a congregation that I might join is,
Mhm.
you know, I love Sunday morning, but my relationships in church have
Mhm.
always come from small groups,
Yeah, small
either a
talk.
religious education class or a workshop. That's
Mhm.
where I've made friends
Yeah.
and really built community. And so I'm always looking for, what are the adult offerings and how can
Mhm.
I be involved? And it's great to have a religious community that cares about that.
Well, I know that you are in leadership, as you've discussed, in BLUU and in the wider UU association. You are a professor, you are a teacher, but you've had teachers and you've had guides. And I would love for you to share with us maybe one of your spiritual teachers and how or why this person's had an impact on you. And I know it's hard to pick one, but if you would pick, is
Ooh.
there one or someone you would talk about as a spiritual teacher or mentor who you've learned from?
Mm. That is a really good question. And, it reminds me even of being a young person and watching the History Channel when the History Channels put religious stuff on
Yeah.
long before they showed, I don't know, Pawn Stars or something.
Right, right. Back before,
Um,
I mean, everybody was white in them, but they were still pretty interesting.
right. And it
Not
was
anymore,
predominantly
though.
white, but that was when I got introduced to people like John Dominic Crossan
Oh,
and even
right.
Anthea Butler or Elaine Pagels and Bart
Oh,
Ehrman and like,
Bishop Spong.
well, and I was gonna say that was when I fell in love with
Oh,
Shelby Spong's work.
okay.
And the fact that he would do week-long education for adults around religion and faith at the Chautauqua Institute in the summer, which being from Western New York, I was familiar with Chautauqua. And I would spend hours on YouTube listening
Mhm.
to his books, listening to his talks and reading his books and the things he had to say, particularly around faith and prayer and the
Mhm.
practice of prayer.
Mhm.
Now that he's gone on, I'm still really moved by a lot of Jack Spong's work. I will say, in Unitarian Universalism,
Mhm.
I have been very inspired by Black UU ministers who have decided to stake their claim in this tradition. Whether that's Rosemary Bray McNatt, who's the president at Star King School for the Ministry right now, our current UUA Association president, Reverend Dr. Sophia Betancourt, um, people like Leon Spencer. Um, oh my goodness. Um, Folks like Jessica York who work in lifespan faith development. I mean, people who have decided to commit their personal faith journey to Unitarian Universalism, but also their professional life to um, lifting up our tradition in the world as a beacon for people who might be looking for an inclusive transformational faith. We don't evangelize in the traditional sense, but UUs do believe in sharing what gives our life meaning. And these are people who were willing to share with me
Like
when I was
your high school classmates at lunch, right? He said, "Hey, come to my
right.
dad's
Well, and
church."
his dad was the Reverend Joel Miller, who I bumped into a few years ago at General Assembly and finally got to tell him how
Mhm.
much his work and his ministry impacted me when I was, 16 and searching.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, people who have decided to commit not only their personal life to living a faithful witness to Unitarian Universalism, but doing it in such a way that other people might see them and be encouraged and inspired by it.
Well, thank you so much for, being spiritually vulnerable with all the listeners and sharing about your passion for Unitarian Universalism and for the way it's giving you space, right? For a faith that feels very authentic to you and holding together, things that other people might see as contradictions.
Well,
So
thank you for the invitation.
where can people find you? Tell us where people can find you, get to you, learn more about you.
Oh, you can always find me at www.takiyahnuramin.com. I'm sure Monica will link that in the show notes for
I
you.
sure will.
And all of my socials and everything you might need to get to me is there. You can also search my name on the UUA website, and all of the writing that I've done about Unitarian Universalism will show up there as well.
Okay, and of course, we'll make sure there are links to that in the show notes. Thank you so much, Dr. Takiyah, for coming on the pod. We appreciate your time and your just sharing of your own story and your own passions and educating us as well about your communities. We ask that y'all just stay with the pod, Tune in for our next episodes and continue to keep learning, keep listening, keep questioning, and keep breaking the rules for how faith is supposed to work. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Diverse Devotions, Black Belief Across Boundaries. I hope today's conversation has sparked something in you, whether it's a question, a new insight, or simply a deeper understanding of the many ways Black folk engage with spirituality and religion. Remember to check out the show notes for more resources. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe or follow, rate, and share to help others discover the power of diverse religious experiences. We'd love to hear from you, so leave a comment or send us a message about your thoughts and experiences at diversedevotions.com. Until next time, keep questioning, keep seeking, and keep breaking the rules of how faith is supposed to work.